Hello, my name is Sam Sims, and I will be going over the Fat Hen menu, both the main dishes and the small plates. So, first up, we've got a shrimp and grits, complete with onions, peppers, bacon, cheese grits, and tasso gravy. My first selection for wine would be a Chardonnay, due to its acidity content. I think it would go well with the saltiness of this dish, as well as cut a little bit of the fat in that bacon and gravy sauce. On the other hand, on a more refreshing note, I would recommend a Pinot Gris, possibly out of California, in part because some of that acidity would help cut the fatness in this dish, and it also wouldn't overwhelm the shrimp, which is the mainstay of this dish. Um, but also, the Pinot Gris carries with it pepper and arugula notes, and I think that would really complement both the onion and peppers in this dish as well. Next item on the menu, we have a crab cake. Uh, with bacon, blue cheese, coleslaw, and french fries. So my first recommendation would be a Sauvignon Blanc, possibly out of New Zealand, in part due to the medium to high acidity, which I think would uh, cut some of the fat from this dish, but still be able to make the crab stand out and be the main focus of this dish. I also think it'd be good for the blue cheese portion of this dish, mostly just because with oak aging, some of the creaminess could be added to Sauvignon Blanc, and so with kind of a butter and cream note, it would carry that blue cheese really nicely. On the other hand, we have a champagne, sparkling uh, sparkling white champagne. I think this would just cut that fried crab cake really well, and sparkling champagne or champagne goes really well with any kind of seafood suggestion. Mostly because it's refreshing and would provide a little bit lighter note on the tongue. So for our next dish, we've got a squash and rice dish, complete with lentils, rice, butternut squash, roasted tomatoes, kohlrabi, goat cheese, arugula, olive tapenade, pistaw, and fine herbs. So my first suggestion to pair with this dish would be a French Pinot Noir, mostly because that high acidity would help out with um, the salt content of this dish, and with that olive tapenade, you've got both salt and oil really coming in as like main flavors. I think they may even overpower the squash, but I think a French Pinot Noir would be really great because it does have a little bit of that tannin structure and acidity, which I think would balance this dish. My second suggestion would be a French Sauvignon Blanc. I may recommend something for similar reasons that I recommended the French Pinot Noir. I would recommend maybe a French Sauvignon Blanc out of the Loire Valley, mostly because of the super sharp acidity and light body, and I think that would just really cut that salt and oily fat content of this dish nicely. So for the next dish, there is a barbecue beef brisket over grilled garlic bread, bacon blue cheese coleslaw, and collard green. My first recommendation for this would be a Sangiovese, due to the high acidity, the high tannins, and the medium body. Both the high tannins and the high acidity would balance a lot of the saltiness and the fattiness of this dish, and you have a lot of that with the bacon blue cheese coleslaw and the brisket itself, and likely there will be a sauce served with it, barbecue sauce, which would only add more saltiness, needing more acidity. My second recommendation goes along those same lines with a Cabernet Sauvignon. Um, and I think it'd be a little bit more full-bodied than a Sangiovese, so you'd get a little bit more of a difference, but still would do a great job cutting both the fat and the salt content of this dish. Next one, we have a meatloaf dish, complete with in-house ground pork, beef, bacon, mashed potatoes, collards, and red eye gravy. So my two suggestions for this meatloaf recipe would be a Zinfandel and a Cabernet Franc. Uh, Cabernet Franc, I just feel would be great. It's a really nice wine to pair with food. It's got a medium to high acidity, and I think it would the kind of like savory, like bell pepper flavors with this wine would go along nicely with the collard greens, as well as cutting some of the fat and salt of the meatloaf. And similarly, we have the Zinfandel, which has a similar effect. I think Zinfandel is probably one of the most meat-friendly wines. You can pair it with beef, pork, sausage, a bunch of different kinds of meats. Whereas a Cabernet Sauvignon, you wouldn't pair with multiple kinds of meats. It's mostly a red meat only dish. And I think just because this meatloaf has ground pork, beef, and bacon, I think Zinfandel would kind of cover all the bases in terms of saltiness, fattiness with its medium body, medium tannin structure, and acidity content. Entree section, we have a fried shrimp with blue cheese bacon coleslaw and French fries. So my first suggestion would be a Chenin Blanc. I just think the high acidity would cut the fatness of that fried shrimp, and also help the wine kind of stand alone. So you'd know that you'd have not an overbearingly overpowering wine, but also something that would go nicely with delicate things such as shrimp. On the other hand, I'd recommend a Gewürztraminer. It's definitely an aromatic grape, and I chose this wine because I think it would actually Gewürztraminer is kind of inherently sweet, and I think the sweetness of this would coincide and match really nicely with the sweetness of the shrimp in this dish. Um, and unlike the Chenin Blanc, which would kind of stand alone, the Gewürztraminer would match really nicely on the tongue. Up next, we have a flounder niçoise, or niçoise, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, with brown butter, herbs, lemon, capers, olives, tomatoes, celery, and bacon cheese grits. My first suggestion for this would be a Sauvignon Blanc, with that acidity and the dryness of that. I think it would just kind of cut some of the fattiness from that sauce, and balance the delicate flavors of the, and with tertiary flavors and aromas, flavors of lime and green apple, and aromas of green pepper and gooseberry. I think it would just coincide really well with the herbal notes, and the kind of creamy, delicate notes of the flounder as well. And my second suggestion would be a semillon, I'm not sure how you say it, specifically for the flounder aspect, especially with a delicate fish like flounder. I think semillon or semillon would work really well because it's not necessarily overbearing. It's pretty light on the tongue, and I think it would work really well with flounder. For our next dish, we have a shrimp and crab, complete with spicy Hoppin' John, bacon, julienne vegetables, spinach, and pimento cheese. So, for two suggestions for this dish, I would recommend a big, buttery Chardonnay. I think this would just kind of complement the crab mostly, and just kind of that inherent sweetness of the crab, uh, as well as my second suggestion, which would be a dry Riesling. And with this Riesling, I think it would provide maybe a little bit more of a richer mouthfeel to the dish, and more layers of fruit as well. Riesling, already coming from a fruit background, I think would go really well with the crab and the shrimp because they're kind of like sweet in amongst themselves, and then combined with the other parts of the dish, I think it would go very nicely. Next dish is a shrimp and pasta, complete with arugula, peas, champagne, house pernod, tomatoes, kohlrabi, capers, artichoke, pistau, and liaison. So my first recommendation would be a muscadet, which is a very dry, light body white wine from the Loire Valley. And I just think the mineral notes of this wine would uh, coincide with the artichoke in this dish, uh, as well as the high acidity kind of balancing the buttery, fatty components of the sauce as well. On the other hand, we've got a Pinot Grigio, and I picked this kind of lean to middleweight white wine because of its uh, kind of like green bell pepper um, herbal notes. I think it would go well with the mixture of um, vegetables in this dish, and I think it would provide a refreshing um, spike to the pasta, which is otherwise very mundane. The other honorable mention for this dish would be a champagne to go, very nicely with the dish because champagne is already in it. Uh, Switching it up a little bit, for our entree, we've got the skinny chicken of the day, something that I should probably be eating. And with this skinny chicken, I'd recommend a Pinot Noir. Um, for the fruit forward notes of this wine, with the high acidity, I just think it'd be refreshing and provide maybe a little bit different mouthfeel. Um, when I think of skinny chicken, uh, I'm not thinking of a whole abundance of flavor, so uh, perhaps a Pinot Noir would be excellent. And for the second recommendation, we've got a Chardonnay, mostly because the Chardonnay goes really well with chicken. It balances the kind of not so robust flavor of the chicken, and an oaky Chardonnay would coincide really well with this one. Next dish, we've got a coq au vin, complete with red wine braised half chicken, bacon, mushrooms, garlic confit, broccolini, baby carrots, and kale. So without a doubt, for this dish, we've got to go with a red Burgundy out of France. It's just the classic wine pairing with this dish. Goes really well with the chicken and with the red wine already in it. It just matches on all fronts. For a little bit lesser of a price point, we've got a Pinot Noir, which is made roughly from the same red Burgundy grapes. And with the high acidity, in this wine and kind of fruit forward flavors. Um, it not only balances the fattiness of the bacon, but I believe would provide some refreshment and an abundance of flavors combined with the mushrooms, the garlic confit, and the broccolini, as well as the rest of the um, vegetables in this dish. We have the seared sea scallops, uh, which combine a local succotash, butter beans, fine herbs, bacon, tomato, garlic, collard greens, broccolini, vermouth, fennel, arugula, and bière blanc. So my first recommendation would be a Pinot Gris, um, preferably out of Germany, um, because they have a nice balance of acidity and a slight sweetness, and I think that sweetness would coincide really nicely of the sweetness of um, the scallops. And I also think the acidic compound of this would match really nicely with the rest of the items, the succotash mostly in this dish, to just cut some of that buttery sauce. And on a similar note, we've got uh, a Riesling, and I think um, a Riesling would go really well for mostly the same reasons. Riesling being a little bit, like an inherently sweet grape, would go very well with the sweetness of the scallop as well. And it's also pretty light, so it wouldn't overpower the rest of the dish. So next up, we've got a salmon dish, uh, salmon béarnaise. Complete with mashed potatoes and garlic spinach. So this béarnaise sauce is a little bit buttery and very rich and creamy. So my recommendation would the salmon would be a gamay. Um, this is mostly for the salmon component, not so much the sauce component. I just think the gamay would go really well with it because it's low. It has a low tannic structure, would keep the salmon from tasting like metallic. And on the other hand, I've got a oaky Chardonnay, and I think this would more coincide with the Béarnaise side of the dish because the creaminess, the creamy and oakiness of the Chardonnay would go really well and complement the creaminess and butteriness of the Béarnaise sauce. Next on the entree menu is a grilled butcher steak with a demi glaze with Béarnaise, garlic spinach, and French fries. So similar to the salmon Béarnaise, I think a full body oaky Chardonnay would coincide really well with the Béarnaise sauce on this butcher steak. Once again, for that buttery, creamy component. And then on the other hand, I think a New World Pinot Noir would go really nicely with this because it'll be very high acidity, and with some of those fruit forward flavors, I think it would provide a little bit more to this dish, and also help cut some of the the fatty component of the butcher steak and the Béarnaise sauce. Entree that we have on the menu is a braised short rib with veal broth, red wine, mashed potatoes, and garlic spinach. So with the red wine being in there as a mainstay combined with the veal broth, I felt strongly that we had to go with two strong red wines to finish it off. So first off, we've got your classic Cabernet Sauvignon. Can't really go wrong with Cabernet Sauvignon with red meat, and I think with the veal broth too. I think the high acidity and medium tannin structure would coincide really nicely with this dish. With the Cabernet Franc, I chose this over Merlot or something like that because on one end of the spectrum, you've got your strawberry and a little bit sweeter, maybe like a red plum roasted pepper taste, and on the other end, you've got this crushed gravel and chili pepper taste. And I think with the veal broth um, and the garlic spinach, I can see that veal broth, kind of almost being a little minerally, and I think that would coincide with the kind of crushed gravel flavors of the Cabernet Franc, as well as the roasted pepper and on the far end of the spectrum, the chili pepper flavors. I think that would go really well with the garlic spinach because garlic carries with it a little bit of that spice. And all in all, I think the Cabernet Franc would really up the ante on this braised short rib dish, whereas the Cabernet Sauvignon would kind of be almost a congruent pair. The Cabernet Franc may take it to a different level. And that has been my review of the Fat Hen menu and all the knowledge that I know about wine. Thank you.